Today is Saturday, March 22nd, 2026, and today is National Goof Off Day, which might be the most honest holiday on the calendar, because every culture in history has eventually discovered that productivity drops dramatically when people would rather be doing literally anything else. Welcome to This Day in History from, wait, that's random. I'm your host, C.L. Burns. On this date in 1794, the United States Congress passed the Slave Trade Act of 1794. This law prohibited American citizens and ships from participating in the international slave trade. Now, the institution of slavery itself still existed inside the United States at that time. Its law didn't abolish that. What it specifically targeted was the transportation business surrounding the trade. In the late 1700s, ships from multiple nations were transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in what was called the triangular trade. Goods went from Europe to Africa. Enslaved people were transported to the Americas, and raw materials went back to Europe. American ships had begun participating in that system. The 1794 law made it illegal for U.S. ships to be outfitted or used for that purpose. The mechanism was actually pretty straightforward. If an American vessel was caught transporting enslaved people across the Atlantic, the ship could be seized and the owners fined. In other words, the government attacked the logistics of the trade. It didn't eliminate slavery itself yet, but it did begin restricting the international infrastructure that supported it. And that idea, regulating systems rather than individuals, shows up again in our next story. On this date in 1895, the Lumiere brothers in France publicly demonstrated one of the earliest projection motion picture systems. They called their invention the cinematograph. Now, the basic idea of the moving picture had existed before this, but the Lumiere machine did something extremely important. It combined three functions into one device. It acted as a camera, a film processor, and a projector. Here's how the illusion worked. A strip of photographic film moves through the camera, capturing individual images extremely quickly, usually around 16 frames per second at the time. When those frames are later projected onto a screen at the same rapid screen, your brain blends them together. This happens because of something called persistence of vision. Your eyes hold on to an image for a fraction of a second after it disappears. If you show someone a sequence of slightly different images fast enough, the brain stops seeing separate pictures and starts seeing motion. The result? Movement where none actually exists. Early audiences reportedly gasped, ducked, and even stepped aside during these first screenings, because suddenly a train or a crowd of people appeared to be moving directly toward them. It was one of the first times humans experienced recorded reality replayed later. And that ability to capture and replay human experience eventually leads us to our third story. On March 22nd, 1963, the Beatles released their first studio album in the United States, Please Please Me. What's interesting is how quickly it was recorded. The entire album was completed in about 13 hours of studio time at Abbey Road Studios. That's because recording technology at the time was very different from what we're used to today. Instead of recording dozens of separate tracks and mixing them later, early studio sessions often captured musicians playing live together in the same room. Microphones fed sound into magnetic tape machines. The tape itself stored sound through magnetization. As audio signals passed through the recording head, they altered tiny magnetic particles on the tape in patterns that represented the sound waves. When played back, those magnetic patterns were converted back into electrical signals and then into sound through speakers. In other words, the tape physically held the shape of the music. The result was an album that captured the raw energy of the band that was just about to challenge global music culture. Sometimes the simplest recordings end up lasting the longest. And speaking of recorded voices and performances, someone born on this day helped create one of the most recognizable characters in television history. And no, I'm not going to try to imitate his voice. William Shatner was born on March 22, 1931, And of course, he's best known as Captain James T. Kirk from Star Trek. And while that role made him famous, what made Shatner interesting as a performer was his delivery, his dramatic pauses, his rhythm, and that slightly theatrical cadence. It turned ordinary dialogue into something memorable, which is probably why people can still imitate it decades later. Sometimes the way something is said becomes just as important as what's being said. When you look at these moments together, something interesting shows up. One story is about regulating a global system. One is about inventing a way to record and replay movement. And one is about capturing music so it can be heard again and again. Different technologies, different centuries, but they all revolve around the same basic idea. Humans building systems that make experiences repeatable. Anyway, those are a few of the things I ended up discovering while wandering through March 22nd. Stop by tomorrow and we'll see where the next date decides to take us. If you want to know more about me or the work I do, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by.